Welcome back to Lifting the Lid today. We are back in these strange seats again. And that makes sense because it is the night before, well, the day before Halloween.
Ooh, spooky.
But you know what isn't spooky?
That Verity's dressed as a pumpkin.
Yeah, it's not
No,
scary.
that is spooky. That is spooky.
Sorry.
But you know what isn't spooky?
What?
Having Sophia with us in the studio.
Producer Sophia! How does it feel?
So weird.
Have we ever done this before?
I've never been a guest on a podcast.
This is the first time!
Because I don't think so anyway.
I'm so honoured. I feel strange seeing you without a laptop on your knee.
Yeah, I know. So context
correct.
for the listeners, which you guys always say. I'm usually sat over there. So it feels really odd being here, no laptop. I'm just directing you from this seat.
Yeah. I really like it, having you here. Like, I feel very safe with you.
That's nice. You've got your cushion and me.
Yeah.
Double protection.
You're going to have to be live producing it though, which I find quite funny. Normally, like, I can see Sophia's brain like ticking, like as we're talking.
Because you have direct eye line because you're here normally.
She's looking at us like, and I can just see her brain like live editing in her head, like, gonna clip out that thing that they just said. That was a bit dead.
And then when we get to the end of a topic and we just like trail off when we've all clearly had enough, and then we look at Sophia, what next?
But that's the thing. I feel like I know you all so well now. I know exactly like who's going to do what when. And I also know your brain because I can see you and I'm thinking, she's going to ask what's next. Or if there's Seran, I know Seran will be like, I can't do this, or I'm scared.
So we were trying to think of helpful guests because Oz, as we've already said, we've said it enough, the man does not need any more praise.
His ego is going to get
His
too
head's
big.
going to be massive.
He was loved. He said to me yesterday on the phone, he was like, yeah, I'm just hoping that the views get as big as where you guys talk about Molly May, which is our most viewed episode.
It's not far off, you know.
It's actually not far off.
Oh my God.
But I was like, the man needs to... The head needs to be a little bit controlled there. Like, we can't let that get out of hand.
I won't say what I was going to say because I think he is the best performing audio episode. Not YouTube, but audio episode.
He's going to be thrilled.
Wow.
Okay, so Sophia
But I'll
probably
delete
feels
that.
a little bit of pressure.
Yeah, it's pressure for you.
Well, yeah, I know. I've got to make it look good and I need to sound good.
Yeah.
You've got it. I have faith.
Yeah.
All the faith.
You're very knowledgeable.
Try my best.
So for that reason, we thought, because everyone loved Oz because he was giving fresh information, a fresh take. And I feel like it is the year of the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, that makes me sound so out of date because obviously podcasts like popped off years ago. But I feel like we're in the era of lots of people want to start a podcast. Lots of creators want to start a podcast.
Yeah. And I think we're in the era of like podcasts being more accessible because I think previously it was like, gosh, you need to have this big set and you need to be signed with big management and have millions and millions of followers. But actually, people are just popping up and making podcasts left, right and centre. And I think it's cool to find out more about how you can do that without investing so much money.
My hot take on it is that it's not that hot a take, it's really not an interesting take at all. Lukewarm take is that it's sort of harking back to the old school YouTube days when someone would just sit in front of, like Zoella, would just sit in front of a camera and be like, so these are my autumn favourites, and then like take you through things and you just be watching them talking. And it's kind of harking back to that because lots of people are doing, or lots of creators just have podcasts, like Madeline Argy will just sit in the car and talk.
Yeah.
Ellie Middleton will just sit and talk on her sofa with a mic. And that is, they all put it on YouTube. So it's kind of the old school YouTube take, but it's a podcast as well, so you can listen
That is a good...
to that audio.
That I'd say that was more than lukewarm.
Tepid.
Tepid, yeah, for sure. I do think it's interesting though, these things like do come back round.
Yeah.
Because like obviously long form, what like she was at the moment, and then that like now it's more short form, but actually like it's so cyclical and you just don't know what's going to come back. And I think podcasts are such a good example of that.
And I do think that we're entering an era where the podcast was very much audio. You listened, but now you are watching. So it's kind of like taking the YouTube format, bringing in podcasts and creating that kind of long form content. And that is kind of the thing at the moment. I guess that's the trend, is video podcasts these days. Obviously, we're doing it. I don't have any conversations with any clients about audio only.
Really? I never listen to podcasts. I only watch them.
I don't think people will necessarily agree with me wholeheartedly on this, but I think that having video creates a marketing tool as well, whereas just audio actually can restrict your growth. So I think there's more opportunity there if you do a video podcast from the outset.
Yeah, I would agree. And also lots of people came at the Be Creator Awards, what they were saying was, we love the clips.
Yeah.
So whether they're actually listening to the podcast, I mean, probably not. Like, I am that person who watches the clips and doesn't listen to the podcast.
I have a confession. I've actually never watched a Jamie and Sophie podcast. Like,
I
I've
thought
never.
you were going to say you've
Same.
never watched ours. I was going to be like, I know.
We
that.
know
No,
that.
but as in, like, I've never watched.
You've never watched it?
What, Jamie and Sophie?
Yeah.
No, I have.
Oh.
No, I've never watched it, but I've just listened to the clips. It's like I've like seen like the viral clips, but I've never actually like sat down and be like, cool, or listened to it.
It's so funny.
You're missing out.
Yeah. I feel like it's one of those things though, but I feel like I can see the vibe.
You get the
it's the same
highlights.
with like the wine one that she does. I
Wednesdays.
get the vibe.
Oh, so
through
I
that.
started by only listening to the clips, and then eventually I was like, no, this looks really good. I need to watch the full thing.
And I think once you're in, you're in. And I, for a long time, I didn't listen to podcasts. I made them, but I wasn't
You're a
a
fraud.
podcast. I was a big fat fraud. But now I can't get enough. I'm like on YouTube all day watching
What was the
stuff.
first podcast you ever listened to or
Oh my
watched?
gosh. I think the one that really hooked me in was My Therapist Ghosted Me.
That's Sarah.
Which we've spoken about before.
Upset, like just truly. I actually think I would be the same. Like, it was one of the first ones that I was just like, wow.
Yeah, like I listen to lots of different podcasts, and I used to work in news, so things like the news agents and stuff was what I listened to for work. But actually, it was that I was like tuning in every single week, absolutely hooked. And then after that, you kind of, I think once you get a taste of podcasts, especially watching them, then you're in, and then you subscribe to everyone, and then next thing you know, you're waiting for next Thursday when Jamie and Sophie's vlog comes out.
I feel my journey with podcasts has been quite bizarre. I would say there was like a time when, for some reason, I used to be like, oh yeah, like I love My Dad Wrote a Porno.
Oh,
I've never listened to
I
it.
didn't
forgot
really.
about that.
I didn't really. I maybe listened to like
Fake fan.
3, and then I'd be like, yeah, I listened to podcasts. Like My Dad Wrote a Porno, and then I'd be like, that's not really that true. Like, I don't know why I'm saying that.
I also forget, because that was the podcast that everyone talked
Would say
about.
they-
That was like their entry level.
But what I actually did like listen to, the sort of podcast I love listening to, is
Diary of a
Sweet-
CEO.
Yes, no, truly. But Sweet Bobby, have you listened to that?
No?
Wait, I watched a documentary about that last night.
Yes.
It's on Netflix. That's what I messaged you
Wait,
about and said I
that's
watched this
so
document.
weird.
I literally messaged Seran last
it's like
night.
is it
Is that a podcast?
Podcast first. Tortoise Media. I like their
God, is it
podcasts.
scary?
It is the most wild story.
What's the concept?
I
No
literally
spoilers?
messaged Seran last night and said, I
spoilers.
watched this documentary on Netflix. It's the most unhinged thing I've ever seen. It's called Sweet Bobby. Watch it.
Wait,
Okay.
that's so weird.
And then you brought that up now.
Yeah.
It's
That's-
basically about this woman who got catfished for like 10 years. I think
Yeah.
it was actually 9 years, but I'm going to round it up to 10.
I loved Catfish, the show.
But
You guys would like this.
when I say when the twist or the
Yeah.
like realization happened, I was like,
Yeah.
like my body physically.
I'm excited. I'm actually watching that tonight.
Well, enjoy. I didn't know
We
it was a
loved
podcast.
the podcast. Elliot and I love the podcast. We were hooked the whole time.
Wow, that's
So
so
I
interesting.
kind of like those. Is that true crime? I guess.
Yeah,
It's
it's
true crime
true crime,
podcast.
it
I
is.
do really like true crime podcast, and now I'm back into the like creator era of like Jamie and Sophie, Stephen Butler.
And I think that's the beauty of podcasts, though, is that you can kind of dip in and out.
Yeah.
So first fact is that everyone usually has about 6 shows that they religiously listen to a week.
6. That's
I think
a
it's
big
something like
commitment.
6.5, so you probably listen to half of one and then bin it off. But yeah, that's on average how many we listen to. But I think a lot of people would admit that they would kind of dip in and out of different shows, and I definitely have waves of like true crime. So I love Crime Junkie, which is the American podcast where they usually talk about unsolved murders. That's not video, but I'm obsessed with listening to that. That's the one I put on when I'm driving a lot, and I'll go through stages of just listening to that and binging old episodes because she's been going for years. But then I'll have my moments of creative podcasts or comedy podcasts. Like I love Parenting Hell, even though I don't have kids. It's one of the funniest podcasts I've ever listened to. So I think people dip in and out depending on how they're feeling, where they're at in their life. But like with music, it's a similar vibe.
Yeah, I think you actually missed off your favourite podcast of all. Right there.
Oh yeah, Lifting the Lid.
Yeah.
Which you listen to every single week without fail.
I do.
After you've edited
Do you
it.
actually?
Again.
Yes.
Oh.
It's the first thing I do on a Wednesday morning. I know when you said it in the other episode, I was like, yeah, I get my cup of tea, sit at my desk, watch it, make sure my heart does little pitter patters because I'm like, please don't have missed anything. Please don't have missed anything. And then we get through it and then I continue with my day.
Oh, that's nice. I feel like it's probably worth us saying what Producer Sophia actually does, because this sounds stupid, but when people used to say, oh, she's a producer,
I didn't get it.
I was like, I don't know what that is, and I don't really get what they do, but now I completely get it.
Did you get it when we first started talking about you doing a podcast?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
because you told me.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad I could educate.
And I guess when I actually started thinking logistically about the things that would have to happen for me to create a podcast, I then sort of realised what it was.
Yeah.
But really the role of, or does it make sense for you to say what the role of the producer is?
So you have, most producers now will do like end-to-end services where you'll have the person on board basically from the moment you say, I think I want to start a podcast, to the point where you finish the season, wrap it all up and decide what you want to do next. So usually people will begin with ideation. You'll think of the idea, you'll start building it out. How I worked with you guys is we did like a discovery session in person, talked about what you want to do, who most importantly you want to speak to, and from that kind of forms the content and the idea.
Do you remember what we even spoke about in that session? Like, was it similar to what we do now?
Yeah, really similar.
That feels like 400 years ago.
It was.
Yeah, it was.
Ages ago.
But it is
like April.
It's worth kind of having that in mind always and reviewing it, and that's something that most producers will do, is think about, actually, are we still serving what we still hitting the targets we intended to hit? Are we still serving the audience that you guys wanted to? And if not, why not? And is that okay? So that's another role of the producer, is to kind of evolve the content as you go through, depending on how it performs, what does well, what doesn't do well. We originally said no guests. Well, that's changed. And so it's a case of kind of evolving as the show goes on. But the role of the producer is basically to make sure that you sound good and that everything you say is all good, and that you are kind of keeping the content engaging, exciting, but also informative, again, hitting those kind of targets that you originally set out. And then as me as a producer, I will kind of come and sit and listen to all of your episode recordings. I'll kind of direct what we want to say, make sure that the flow works, and then I take the footage away and then I edit it all. And from that, we then get the full episode that everybody watches and listens to.
Can I just jump in and say that role of sitting and listening and making sure the flow works, I think I would have underestimated the importance of that.
Yeah, me too.
I would be like, oh, well, we'll just like, we'll talk, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
I'll lead it, it'll be no problem at all. But actually, it's so important having you there.
I'm really glad you said that as well, because I think that sometimes, like, I talk about this on LinkedIn a little bit, because people often say, oh, is that really how much you charge for a podcast? But actually, the real importance is you have some sort of structure and flow. So many podcasts I stop listening to because I don't know where they're going, or they've harped on too much about ththings that I have no context on, or like there's too many in jokes, or again,
you probably do a lot of those things.
But I think
all
we're
edited
talking
out.
about you.
No, but I remember at the beginning, a lot of the time we'd be talking about things, and then Sophia would be like, right, can we just like add a little section where you give a bit of context about how a brand deal works, or who this person is, because we would just yap on as we do, and having that like structure and guidance is so helpful, because you can get so wrapped up in just talking.
Well, yeah. How many times do you probably send things to each other and think, I've been in this document, plan, whatever, for far too long, I need eyes on it. And therefore that's essentially the role of the producer. You're kind of having a bird's eye view. You're very much removed from what's being talked about, because you lose track of what you're saying, but actually having somebody sitting there and keeping notes of what's being said, and identifying those key moments, or thinking, actually, hold on, roll back, you've lost track here, let's go back to that, or give context to XYZ. That is so important, because with that creates an engaged content from start to finish. And that's ultimately what makes a successful podcast. Without that, you don't have a good concept, and therefore people aren't going to keep tuning in.
Isn't it kind of great? We're doing a podcast about podcasts. It's pretty meta, guys.
That is.
So you come and record with us, and then
we edit the podcast, make sure it all flows. Then you insert all the jingles, etc. And obviously, with there being a visual element, we have some sort of visual that goes in to make sure that it looks visually pleasing when we change scenes or topics, etc. And then I will then send that to you to approve, Verity. So it's very much a case of you having eyes on it, making sure that you're across like quality control. If there's anything you want me to edit out, which we'll often have a conversation like, what do you think about this bit? I want this bit taken out, and then I will make those changes. You will either review, or often you just trust me to make those calls, which is very nice and appreciated. And then that episode then gets uploaded with a title, with a design thumbnail, and also a description. Now, at the moment, most podcasts are kind of doing specific descriptions for guest episodes, but then podcasts like this, like creator episodes, creator podcasts like Jamie and Sophie, etc., they will have like a generic description that's used, and then you'll update with links, etc. So all of that's written. You have SEO done as well, and then the episode gets released. But also in that time, I'm creating a trailer for social media and all of the social media clips. And that in itself is a whole nother job. And you want to make sure you get all of the viral moments, all of the moments that are well captioned, they're engaging, they move, they have lots of emojis, and they keep people hooked in throughout that 1 minute clip.
Although other people maybe aren't as desperate to have lots of emojis as we are. We're like, yeah, as many emojis as possible in there. Must have flash.
I love it. I think it's really fun. And I
so.
then see clips that don't necessarily do that, or have clients that don't want that. And I think, the content still fits, but I think for my brain, it's nice to see everything moving, and it does almost psychologically keep you hooked, which is like the whole point in short form content.
And I will say that I don't think Sophia could edit our clips better.
No, I agree.
Same.
Thanks.
Like, it is exactly what I wanted. It was the vision.
Yeah.
But that took a little bit of time to get right in terms of, and that's another important role of the producer. I think it's making sure that you kind of leave any ego you have at the door. You have to trust in what your client wants. And even if there are things that your client asks for, which happens with me regularly, the client will say X and I'll say, oh gosh, I'm not sure that we should do that. But if that's what they want, you have to honour that. And I'm sure you guys have it with your work. Everyone does. There are things that you might not necessarily agree with, but you do. And it's important that you execute that vision for your client as best to your ability, whilst also offering that advice and expertise along the way too, because it's okay to kind of say, actually, I think we should do it this way. And the best clients, I think, are the ones that kind of work with you. And I like to collaborate with my teams. And I think we have that kind of relationship really down. And when we were doing the shorts at the beginning, it was like, can you make the text slightly smaller? Can we have fewer breaths, etc.? And those are small things, but they make a big difference. And now every week I know exactly what you want, exactly what the clips are going to look like. And all you have to do is then review them and off they go.
Yeah.
To see if they go viral.
Into the ether.
What?
Ether.
No, I feel like that was very like Welsh like accent coded of you to say ether.
Do you know what it could have been?
Accent coded.
No, was
talking
it that
about?
my mum says ether because she's Welsh?
Yeah, it's giving that energy. But like, I am also Welsh, but it's ether.
We wanted our creators to get what they need from this episode, so we went out to our followers and we asked them to come back with some questions for producer Sophia.
I love that it's always producer Sophia. Like,
Yeah.
first name producer, surname Sophia.
This is an interesting one, and I think we'll all have a take on this. If I have no following, is creating a podcast a good idea?
I think it's always a good idea if you have a concept that is worth listening to. And look, think about the people who originally started podcasting. Many people who are now successful podcasters had absolutely no following, and they have now become influencers, etc., as a result of that, or they have then created the kind of brand for themselves as a podcaster. So I think if you have a concept that is really worth pursuing and you believe in it and you're willing to commit to it, then absolutely give it a go and make sure that what you're doing is consistent and there is a space in the market for it. Because I think that is one of the things that is tricky at the moment, is kind of getting your head above the parapet, and there's lots of noise in the podcasting space, so making sure your concept sticks out and that you have a target audience you want to speak to too.
And I feel like, on a thinking more from a manager side, you have to start on a platform, right? Whether you start on TikTok, Instagram, obviously back in the day everyone started on YouTube, then people started to go onto Instagram, and then loads of creators started on TikTok. Podcasting is just another form of social media that you can start on. So obviously, if you're starting a podcast and it's just on Spotify and on YouTube, get the clips on socials, so you're getting it across all the platforms and making the most out of what you've got to say to build that following.
It all like bolsters each other up.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. And I think also be mindful of what success looks like to you, because even though you might not have a following, like, does that mean you have 0 followers? Does that mean you have 100 people, 1,000 people? Having 100 people in a room to listen to you talk would be incredible, right?
Yeah.
We'd all love that and see that as a great success. So think about the fact that you could potentially speaking to 50 or 100 people every week, you know, with your podcast from the outset. That's great, and don't underestimate that, because from there you can build. And it is very much about consistency and committing to the goal long term with podcasting. It's a slow growth process, which is hard when we're in like a short form, immediate success world where things go viral, and that's kind of what we're conditioned at the moment to think is success. But actually, if you were given an opportunity to speak to a room full of 50 or 100 people, you'd take it. So see the value in that with your podcast.
I love that.
Thanks.
Preach.
Me too.
Also, I was going to say on that, like, I know that you mentioned like this like discourse of like everyone, like there's like, I feel like I keep seeing TikToks of like everyone's starting a podcast, it's so annoying, like you don't have, like not everyone has something to say, like shut up. Like I keep seeing TikToks of people saying that and I'm like, oh my god, like stop. But also on that discourse, like what do you think of that, and how do you think people can combat that if they're thinking, oh, I want to start it, but people are saying that there are too many out there?
I think don't let that kind of narrative put you off, but let it make sure it lets you ask a question of yourself, like, do you have something to say? Is there something that you can add, you know, value to? Can you educate people on something? Can you entertain people on something? Because it's important to kind of think about why you're starting it. And I think that's one of the first questions I asked, and probably asked all of you, is why are you doing this? And I was really pleased, because every time I go in, I feel always nervous about that question with any client discovery kind of meeting or call. So why are you starting this? And some people have said, because I want to be famous, I want to earn loads of money, I want to have hundreds of thousands of followers. And that ultimately might come, but that shouldn't be the reason. And if that is your reason for starting, I would say don't.
I mean, that's why I'm here. Really.
Well, exactly.
Personal brand.
We're working on it, Lucy.
I would say everything we do pretty much harps back to democratize knowledge. Space, lift the lid. So like that answer for us was probably fairly easy.
On that topic of like people saying they just want to make loads of money from making a podcast, I feel like you'll both be able to answer this, but I never used to understand like how people actually made money from podcasts. Like at first when I started listening to them, I just didn't get it. So like it'd be great to know like from your professional side.
So there are several ways that you can make money from podcasting, and I'll try and remember to list them off and then go through them. So you can monetize through sponsorship. That is kind of the first thing that everyone is doing, and that can either be through direct sponsorship or through advertising using like ad agencies or monetization platforms like Acast, etc. You can then think about affiliate links are becoming more and more popular with podcasting, paid for content that's behind a paywall, merchandise, tours.
So many different ways.
God,
it's actually
amazing.
crazy.
Yeah.
And they can all kind of, one can come first, or they can all kind of, you know, pull into another. And I think traditionally everyone thought of podcasts as being like ad placements and that being the traditional way to make money. But actually it's not immediately that lucrative. So you get paid on CPMs, which are cost per 1,000 listeners. So CPM is usually around sort of $18 to $30, I think, at the moment, although don't quote me on that,
That's
does change.
quite high, is it not? Like in comparison to your YouTube's TikTok.
It's not a bad rate, but if you only have 1,000 listeners per week, obviously that only equates to kind of, you know, just shy of $80 per month.
Yeah.
But as that number goes up, you earn more, and you can also then negotiate more what that payment is.
And with Acast, like with who?
Yeah, who's that payment from?
So you can either do it directly with ad agencies. So you might sign up to an ad agency who will go out and do those negotiations for you and set up its CPM rates. But often it's kind of a preset rate, or it's estimated. And there will be some ads that will pay more to appear on your podcast because they know that they're able to kind of really leverage that.
So it's kind of like a more complex version of like the YouTube partner program, or what it was called back in the day, where you would get paid by YouTube. But is this coming from Spotify, from Acast? Like, who is
Yeah,
this
so
came from?
Acast is the platform that I use, and
Okay.
that is kind of the monetization strategy at the moment. So you sign up to a monetization program, you get paid out from that, and it's estimated. But then you can kind of, if you say, for example, have 10,000 listeners per week and more, that's usually the marker you look to then start discussing things with ad agencies. And a lot of the big podcasts like My Therapist Ghosted Me or Help I Sexted My Boss, they will work directly with these ad agencies because they not only negotiate sponsorship opportunities and partnerships, but also that ad revenue too.
That's so interesting.
Wow.
And contextually, guys, we have made £20 so far.
Gosh, get ourselves a couple of chocolate bars.
Yeah, so
Join
that
the juice sandwich for lunch.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of rounds off their AdSense side. I'd love to go more into sponsorships. Let's talk about sponsorships because I think it'd be good to break it right down.
Yeah, like
further
the
into
process.
Yeah, so sponsorships I think are very much a kind of ever evolving thing with podcasting at the moment. And I feel like we're at an age, or we're at a point in the podcasting space where, like when newspapers were still kind of championing themselves and trying to get adverts, but TV was coming up fast behind it, and people and brands were too scared to advertise on TV because they thought that newspapers still held like the space. We're in that space at the moment where people are still slightly nervous to sponsor and put their hat in the ring for podcast sponsorship, but there are some brands who are really seeing the value of it, so therefore we can at this point negotiate sponsorships directly, and that can be exclusive or non-exclusive, and that can be for things like pre, mid or post roll, so depending where the ad sits. So pre-roll being obviously at the start of the episode, that's definitely the highest earner, and that's the one that people can negotiate the highest fee for because you are prime position as at the moment people press play. Mid-roll obviously is halfway through the conversation, and that is also quite lucrative but less so than the start. And the post-roll is often quite a small fee because not many people statistically finish an entire podcast.
And is that the ads where the host will like read it and they're
Yeah.
like, this episode is sponsored by BetterHelp?
So there are two versions. You can either do dynamic ads, and it's really difficult because some of those ads are put into podcasts like automatically by the likes of Acast and those ad platforms, but some have been inserted by producers, by the teams, because they have been made for and presented to the podcasters by the brand and paid for directly, and therefore you would probably switch off ads onto your podcast to make that a priority. So that is something that is hard to kind of differentiate between. There's no real reason with knowing. The host reads are obviously are clearer, so we may pay, say a Sonia might get paid to read an ad in the middle of her podcast, and she'll get paid X amount of money to do that every week, and therefore the podcast is then sponsored by BetterHelp, for example.
And I also feel like this is where we as managers come in, so we're pitching out for that type of sponsorship more than anything.
Yeah.
Until obviously they have events and all the rest of it off the back of their podcast.
And I think you see big podcasts like Parenting Hell, which is with Rob Beckett and Josh Widdicombe. I think that their podcast is exclusively sponsored by Rightmove, as in, or
That
it might
is
be
such a
non-exclusive.
cool sponsor.
Yeah, it's cool, and it's really appropriate because they've really thought about who their audience is.
Yeah.
It's families. The people are moving all the time,
Really
and for a
clever.
lot of the podcast, Rob was moving in during the show.
Wow.
So they sponsored. I don't know if it was exclusively or non-exclusively, but I think it was kind of appeared on the actual artwork. So you saw their artwork, and at the bottom it was sponsored by.
Oh, I saw
that comes at
that.
a premium.
With was it Fern McCann just announced her podcast about being a parent, and it's sponsored by some parenting brand, and it's like the artwork, I'm sure it's Fern McCann, and it's like blah 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 blah, I can't remember what it's called, always little baby or
Must be a
something
really
like
good
that. I remember thinking the name was really long and wordy and I wouldn't remember, and it was like with brand like on the artwork, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Like I haven't seen many people launch a podcast with a brand.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I think is definitely we're on the cusp of, right? And obviously I think we can say this, that I'm working with some of your creators to hopefully talk about podcasts and where we can take that. And that is something that we would look to do. I think we're entering a new phase where brands will see an opportunity to invest not just in sponsorship for podcasts, but also get content on platforms like TikTok and Instagram. And it's like this 360, 180, however you want to describe it, ad sponsorship where they're having all of the content. And so they might get, Sonia might do, I don't know, a weekly reel and also feature that brand in their mid-roll positioning on their podcast. So they're getting kind of two approaches. They're getting more value from a brand perspective. They're, you know, tapping into both the long and the short form content, and there will be audiences for both that are separate and audiences that straddle both. And so it's important that brands kind of see the value in doing that.
Yeah, I feel like for us as well, like that makes so much sense and feels so much more authentic as well. Like, you know, it's sort of akin to like a long-term partnership, but it's more horizontal. Is that the word? Holistic.
Horizontal. I knew what you were going for, like across all the platforms.
Yeah, horizontal.
And you talk about like authenticity. Podcasts are the best media platform you can advertise on.
Yes, I heard this on an advert on
The stats
Acast.
are crazy, and I'm not going to try and pretend to know them off the top of my head, but I include it in all the sponsorship brands that we do, sponsorship decks we do when we do outreach, because it is like something like 60% of listeners will go on to look at that brand or even purchase something. Something like 90% of people will consider that brand and making a purchase.
Why do you think that is?
I think because of the way we listen, it's so intimate, and because we are in it for the long haul, right? Long form content means we're sitting down to view something, and we don't mind really watching these adverts, and we also trust these people. So there's a real, you have to really stress when you're kind of negotiating those sponsorship deals that it's the right fit for the hosts, because you want to make sure that they're endorsing something that they believe in, because that's far more authentic, and therefore it's more likely that that person's going to go across and you know, the listener's going to go and buy a product or look at a website or you know, sign up to something.
So I think this is the question that is on everyone's lips. How much money can be made when podcasting, or with a successful podcast?
How long is a piece of string?
Classic.
You gave that answer to someone.
I know.
You literally said it like 2 episodes ago.
No, I know. Well, I wouldn't know, would I? I didn't listen to it.
Yeah, it is really hard to say, and it very much depends on like what your listenership is, who the people are hosting it, what kind of space you take up in the industry. And you can earn kind of £100 maybe a month from that CPM's inserted ads that we spoke about at the start. But then that can increase as you go on. So as you build your audience, you build your listenership, the more listeners you get, obviously the more you're going to earn from that. And that is something that can be, you know, anything from £100 to several £1,000s every month. One of the other things that people should really consider is diversifying their income streams with podcasting. So a lot of people now are doing tours, because that is an instant, you know, you sell tickets, you instantly know how much you're going to make, and therefore you can kind of really demand that monetization piece there. And it's important that people kind of don't just see podcasting as, I put my episode out and I hope I get money in. You really want to make sure that you can kind of access other monetization streams. And one of the other ways that people really make money is by putting things behind a paid platform. So Patreon and Apple subscriptions were always like the big ones. And to be honest, it's not a lot of money to ask for. A lot of people will charge, say, £5 a month to their premium listeners or whatever you want to call them. And usually you get something in return, whether it's a bonus episode, whether it's ad-free content, whether it's Q&A, early release, whatever it may be. And you will often have those kind of hardcore fans that will come and pay for that, because they invest in you, they believe in you. And I think there's a thing with podcasts, everyone knows that in order to keep going, there has to be some kind of money that's exchanged to help people really pursue that. So that you can earn quite a lot of money from as well, depending on how many people you have. The highest podcasts, the Joe Rogans, the Call Her Daddy, they negotiated exclusivity deals.
So is that where one brand works with them and that's it.
Yeah, Call Her Daddy, I think, did a sponsorship deal, did an exclusivity deal, sorry. I'm not entirely sure for how long or what the ins and outs were, but it was $60 million.
Fuck me.
Joe Rogan
What?
did the same for
And that's
$100 million.
A brand has paid that, or Spotify?
Spotify
To have
exclusive.
the podcast exclusively
They
on
went
Spotify.
through a Spotify exclusive era, and now I don't think they're doing it anymore.
I get why they do it, because I can't lie, that was actually one of the reasons I switched back from Apple Music to Spotify. Saffron Barker and Anastasia released their podcast as a Spotify exclusive, and I really wanted to listen to it because I've watched them for years, so I literally swapped over to Spotify because of that. It makes sense.
I've just got Disney Plus because I want to watch Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, and it's only on there.
Yeah.
So that's why people did it, because it was to take you to that specific platform. And I think that's where it's been done really, really well, because with YouTube, for example, it's kind of the only main contender at this point of recording this podcast that, you know, where you can go and watch that long form content from creators that people can upload, whereas there are more with Amazon, Spotify, Apple, all of, you know, and many others like Deezer and iHeartRadio, and there's loads of places you can get podcasts. So that's why those exclusivity deals came through, but the money was big.
That's insane.
But I will caveat that with, you don't necessarily have to have one of these 1% top performer podcasts in order to make some money. I know of a podcast that a few years ago was very much serving an audience that was kind of underserved at that point. It was educational content, and I was told that they secured a year's sponsorship for £100,000.
Wow.
And that meant that they could then expand their team. They were then able to put on events, and they were sponsored across that. So it was a year sponsorship, which obviously they negotiated, which you guys will know about. Yeah. But now that podcast is consistently performing. They have a great podcast set that they use every single time they record and film episodes. They're doing events, they're doing YouTube content now, and that investment, because a brand took a chance on them, has massively paid off. You just need one brand to really believe in, and that can then start, you know, a really good pot of money.
You need, sorry, but it's really giving. You just need one person in the room to believe in you, and then everyone else does. Have you seen that, the Lady Gaga clip? And in every interview, she's like, just one person in the room, and then she repeats that in every single interview that she does.
You just need one yes, that's what you need.
Yeah. If you guys want a part 2, let us know, because I feel like we have not even touched the surface. Yeah. Like, I wanted to talk about, are we gonna have enough time for this? Davina McCall has just announced Begin Again with Flight Studio. For me, I felt like that was massive. I know I'm bringing it back to Stephen Bartlett, but I'm sorry. It is such a big move. I think Flight Studio, he is using his expertise in socials to attract traditional TV talent who want that expertise, who need to create a narrative of their own and content that they own, content channels that they own, and to be able to, I guess, speak without broadcasters. And he's really nailing that. Like, the fact he's got Davina McCall, like, I mean, for me, she is like OG vibes.
That's really cool.
And I think that podcast will be incredible because she is iconic, and his podcast with her was amazing.
Yes, it was so.
Can't believe we've not spoken about Diary of a CEO.
No,
oh, we have mentioned it.
Yeah. So now he's created this sort of funnel where he's speaking to these people, realizing whose podcasts do amazingly, and then suggesting Flight Studio to them that they create their own podcast, and using his social media expertise to make that happen, which I just think is so clever.
It really is.
When Flight Studio was announced, I remember seeing it all over LinkedIn, because I naturally follow pretty much everyone that works on Diary of a CEO, because they are smashing it. And I remember seeing it announced and messaging my podcast buddies, and everyone was like, what is it? No one quite knew what it actually was, because I think there was a lot of kind of careful copy written about it, a lot of hype, a lot of buzz, and obviously everyone know Diary of a CEO, they know Stephen Bartlett, but no one was quite sure what it was doing. And we now know, obviously, it's basically a media production company, and that is the kind of steps that they're taking. And when they started to announce the talent they'd signed, like Davina and Paul from Celebs Go Dating and others, I think there's been 5 or 6 announcement shows, then people got an understanding of what it was. And I think it's such a smart move, because Stephen Bartlett has definitely seen, or he's figured out how to make a successful podcast. He has huge teams, and this is one thing I would say to anyone listening: I always get clients saying, I want this like Diary of a CEO. And I think you have to set expectations for people that they have humongous teams.
That was not me, by the way.
No.
It was.
It wasn't a Sonia,
was.
it was a Sally or a Susan. But that is often the benchmark. And, you know, I have had to say to clients, look, you want X intro to look like this, like Diary of a CEO, but there is only one of me, sometimes 2 or 3 freelancers, not, you know, sort of 4 or 5 people working on this, or one person working on just the trailers each week.
And you're going to need so much money to do that as
Yeah.
well.
It's an awful lot of money.
It's insane.
And I'm not entirely sure how Flight Studio are working with their talent. I think it's a profit share, which I obviously think is a smart move. And I think there is also investment because he has announced Flight Fund, which I think I read there was something like £100 million worth or dollars worth of investment there.
Oh, wow.
Now, I don't know if that fund is directly funding the studio and the podcast being made, but I believe it's for other ventures, etc. It's like venture capital. But he is also investing in smaller creators and offering people kind of advice and production.
That's
and
good.
stuff.
I'm glad they're doing that as well. Like giving back to...
Yeah.
If you could guess, how much money annually do you think Diary of a CEO makes?
I think it's 1.2 million.
That was
That's
really
very
specific. How do you know that?
specific.
Have you read that?
Yeah.
I was actually expecting it to be more than that.
Same kind of.
No, but just
As in,
from the podcast.
I mean,
like,
guys, I'm not turning my nose up at 1.2 million.
There is a
No,
lot
that is
that can
a
be
lot.
democratized
Yeah,
about
Yeah.
podcasting because people don't know. People hide, you know, rates, etc. They hide like what that sponsorship entails, and maybe it's the case that everyone's just figuring out, so they don't really know.
Yeah.
But I do think we're at a position where, you know, we're starting to understand a little bit more about sponsorship deals, about what people could ask for, because it's hard and it's a space we're all learning about, and nobody knows it in podcasting, and it's always changing.
And we need a Lifting the Lid podcast edition.
that's what this is.
No, I know. But as in, I mean, the equivalent of
Lifting the lid for
Lifting the
podcasts.
Lid for podcasts.
Well, I think we just need to get Sophia
thank
back
us later. Or we could get Sophia back on.
on. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Yes, please comment below if you would like us to have Sophia back on. What have we learned, guys? What are the takeaways?
There's so many different ways to make money on podcasts.
But it's a slow burner.
Yeah.
You've got to be really consistent, post weekly or whatever cadence you agree, and just keep at it.
Find your
Yeah.
why as well.
Yeah,
Yes.
find your why, be consistent and and you know, commit to that content. Most podcasts fail after 9 episodes. Most people do 9 episodes, then stop. And if you hit that, over that, you're in a high percentage
We've
of
made
the
it.
category.
That's incredible.
12
A
days.
lot of the
No,
13.
this is 14.
14, yeah.
most podcasts that are still on Spotify and stuff aren't active, so you're also ticking another big box.
Yay!
But I think it's just committing to the long term and making sure it's something you can stick to. Don't go above and beyond to think I'm going to create these massive productions and get all these guests, because it's a lot of work. Everyone I speak to says, God, it's really hard starting a podcast. It's really difficult doing this, which is why you should think about, if you can afford it, getting some help.
Yes. Go follow Sophia on Bear Lane Productions. That is your tag.
It is.
But don't ever leave us, Sophia. Don't
No.
get too popular and then leave us.
Me and you gals, we're in it
Yeah.
for the long haul.
And now Sophia needs to do the outro.
Yeah.
The whole thing. I knew you were going to say this. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Lifting the Lid. You can subscribe and follow wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on socials. Just follow at TBH Talent and Lifting the Lid Pod. Yeah. That's right, that's new. And we're also on YouTube, so you can watch us. Just search Lifting the Lid. And we'll see you next time.
Bye. You did that in one.
What a pro.
I used to be a newsreader.